Now she's here to talk to you and with you about user experience in gamification, the great Melinda Jacobs.
Hello. Good afternoon, almost afternoon.
Well done.
Close enough. All right, so today, what I want to talk to you guys about is UX and gamification. How many people here have heard the term UX, or user experience? Or what about human-computer interaction? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
The older school version of UX. Well, some of you people may recognize this guy, Don Norman. He's considered by a lot of people to be one of the founding fathers of UX. There were some people that actually talked quite a bit about it before him, but he really was the biggest proponent, and he really pushed it through. And his reasoning for this was, I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with the system. Well, this makes sense. As designers, we're designing experiences that we hopefully want to understand how the user will enjoy them, experience them, from start to finish. To just look at one component, like usability, well, it's not quite enough. So what's his definition of user experience? Well, the user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. That's a pretty broad definition. And actually, a lot of people have different thoughts on it as well. For some people, UX is what the product would do, a very functional approach. For some people, it's system design. Others, the user's interaction with the product accessibility, design based on the user's need, user-centered design. But as you can see, what all of these, and even more that I didn't actually manage to fit on the slide, is it all comes down to one thing, the user. So if we look at a sort of simplified approach to this, is typically you have a story, or an object or an artifact, you have an interaction with that, and you have your user. So in this sort of general map of interaction, what we're talking about with user experience is this guy over here, the user. And this is one of the reasons, and I'll go a bit more into it later about how that relates to gamification, of why it's so crucial and important that we understand UX more when we're doing gamification, that gamification itself is not just standalone. It needs this field, it needs this aspect, it needs this approach, and it can't really necessarily encompass it itself. Because what UX is all about is understanding and learning from real users. Everyone's always a little intimidated by the concept of real users when they're starting a project. So many times I hear from people, yeah, but it's not ready to test yet. Oh, but we only have one chance to go to product launch. Yeah, but just a little more tweak and it will be there. Well, this is what UX does for those of us who, which is pretty much all of us in all honesty, are sitting there a bit cold feet and like, oh, can we really launch this yet? Is it says, yes, you should have already done something about this, probably ages ago. And hopefully you're early on in your project enough that you can use this to catch things like different directions or things you might need to change, because the fact is people are really unpredictable and can be really weird in the behaviors they do. And they're also not particularly great at telling you even why they think a certain way or why something strikes them in a certain manner. So the more that you start testing with users from an early on, more you start having that conversation, the better off your designs are going to be later. And there's always ways to manage expectations. A lot of other speakers today, and also I'm sure in the coming day, will talk about that managing expectations is always important in a project. Same thing when you're talking to your users. But people are pretty smart. We're pretty understanding. We understand if you give us context of what we're testing something in. I'm going to do a very brief nod of the head to another U term, UI. How many of you are familiar with that? Yeah, a little less, about the same. This is not to be confused with UX, though. This is user interface. So this is one of the components of UX, typically, about how exactly does this interaction here work on a functional level. It's also not just reserved for digital products. Interfaces can be physical, and they can be event-based, they can be context, they can be structure. But this is just one of the components of how we facilitate this interaction when we're talking about this big picture of user experience. But at the end of the day, the user is so crucial because that's who you're building it for. You're not building it in a vacuum. You're building it so this person here connects with something you think is important enough to actually build this whole experience over. And this experience can be a game, where it's more fictional, it's not so much tied to reality. It can be a product. It can be content, information. There's so many things it can be, but it still always has an end user, with gamification as well. We focus quite a bit on that user because we're trying to motivate them, we're trying to engage them. We're trying to get them to see a perspective that maybe they didn't see before. Now, some people, you can run a line that's a little close to manipulation in that manner, and there's a lot of ethical debate right now on how far is too far. But a lot of times, for those of us with good intentions, we just really want to help them figure out what's so important, what it is that we really want them and we really believe their life will be better for. So you might come to this conclusion that we are designing the user's experience. Yeah, it makes sense. We're designing this product. We're designing how they're going to experience it. But actually, we're not at all. What we're designing is the intended experience. Because here's the secret truth about design. We don't own the user's experience. I have a goal of this talk today, but I don't own the way you guys will actually experience it. That is unique to yourself. So when we design, we have to remember this, is nothing is ever set in stone. We don't actually own exactly how they're going to experience our product, experience our service. We just try to build the best experience we can to get to the intended result. And this is one thing that UX understands very, very strongly. Because they get that you can't control people. You can only help guide them. You can only try to take them into consideration in making it successful, that your goals and their experience align together. So, Whiteside and Nixon, actually some of the first people who did coin the term UX, say usability exists in the experience of the person. If the person experiences a system as usable, it is. This also goes in reverse. On paper, you might have designed the most usable experience you could ever have thought. This is such a flawless system, everyone's going to be able to use it, it's so intuitive. But if your users don't think it is, it's not. It's about perception. If a tree falls in a forest, you can design that. But if they don't really pay attention or perceive it in that way, or they're like, well, actually, I think it cracked and timbered a little bit more than fall, well, it didn't do what you thought it was going to do, because the user has to perceive it in order, and they have to agree with you that it is successful. And this is why talking to actual users is the only way to figure this out during your design process, during the time you use gamification. But so what is gamification? Well, as I say very much as a broken record at pretty much every talk I do, I see it as an observation that games are extraordinarily successful at creating engagement and triggering states of flow. I see it also as a decision to design experiences based on a narrative in a similar manner of which we would design a game. Why is this? Because we're hoping and we have a goal of achieving similar levels of interactivity and engagement. In some cases, you could also add immersion into that. And there's a lot of other terms that you could list with games. We don't have time for that in this talk, but all in all, this is really what we're doing when we talk about gamification. We realize is that games are incredibly good at telling stories, stories that pull us in, stories that allow us to interact with it, stories that get us to care. And part of the magic of games is that there's no reason we should care. I mean, games just exist in this lovely little vacuum where they don't necessarily are tied to the real world. Sure, some are. But game designers have this huge and challenging job to build a world, to build a story, to tell this story in a way that draws you in without there being another need to. So if we look at this chart again, we say, all right, where really does gamification come in? Is it over here with the user? Is it over here with the story? Is it with the interaction? And what I would say, and again, there's a lot of debate on exactly what UX is and exactly what gamification is, but basically what gamification gives us is, then in this chart, is a way, a purposeful, attentive, playful way to talk to and alter the story and have the story talk back. We recognize that there are components from games, some of these listed below, that allow games to do that very well. And so we say, hey, okay, You know, this is a common model for anything, not just about games, not just about fictional stories. How can we use these things that create the magic circle, to help get people closer to our narratives, even if they do relate to something more in real life, or if they do relate to a topic we wouldn't think that was that engaging from the beginning, or that's maybe confusing. And you see a lot of these. Narrative is a very important component of games, rules, goals, characters, and of course, everyone's favorite terms, mechanics. I would just like to point out here that this is one, I think, of the most difficult words to use when you talk about gamification. It's easy in a way, because it is a true thing, even with games, there are mechanics out there. Mechanics exist to make your life a little easier. They're sort of best practices, you could call it, of game design. They're like, oh, this structure works to kind of achieve this purpose. These leaderboards, it helps us create this competition. Oh, okay, you know, if we give points, it's a really good way to give feedback to the environment. So if you lose 2 health by stepping on this oozing pile of goo, okay, you've learned something there. So it's a good feedback system. But what we have to make sure as gamification practitioners when we see that word is we realize that game designers don't just use mechanics as pop and play. They're not just like, oh, okay, in Mario, yeah, we're just going to add a jump mechanic, and that's fine. What they're actually doing is they're saying, okay, we have this foundation to work from. We think this could be an engaging way to help people interact in this environment. But they start with a foundation, and they still build it up. The mechanic still has to be designed. It's not just plug and play. It's not just ready. So when we say mechanics, these aren't just chunks of ready-to-go, integratable ideas and concepts that you can just kind of put in and be done with. These are just starting foundations for us to do what games are so good at, which is figure out how does this help this user interact with this narrative. And we're going to start from a foundation to save a little time, because it's a best practice. It tends to work well. But we're always making sure, does this fit our goal? Does this fit our goal of the story? And as a quick sort of check-in point on what a narrative is, we can call it a collection of stories, how they are sort of bound together. And on a more technical term, narrative is how you tell that story, how you tell this collection of stories, and how then that interaction between your user and the narrative is fulfilled. And this is really gamification's big van. This is their big picture. Gamification knows how to do this well. Game design knows how to do this well. And what do both gamification and the user's perspective have in common? Well, storytelling. Why is storytelling so important? Well, our brains are most active when we're listening to stories. In fact, if you have someone reading a bullet point list, you'll note that actually only the language processing part of your brain is active. All of a sudden, you start to tell a story, and an interesting thing happens. The parts of our brain that would be otherwise engaged maybe in the activity in the story or in the way you're moving in the story or acting or experience or tasting or feeling, they also become active. This is the same thing of why UX in a way needs gamification, is because you can have multiple touch points in a product, multiple moments of contact with the user, but to just have a couple moments of contact without bringing everything together, well, that's not a story. That's the same thing as a bullet point list. And so what gamification helps us do is to take those touch points, to take what we need from the user, to take what we want to hear from them, to take what we want to give, and bring it all together into a conclusive and cohesive story. Because, and I really love this quote from Robert McKee, sometimes reality is too complex. Stories give it form. And for me, this is a lot of what gamification represents. It gives stories form. We use this to help us tell this. And UX, it's there for us to actually help us figure out how do we understand the users, because we have to know what stories we're telling. And gamification helps us do this. Narrative design helps us do this. But UX says to us, okay, it's all well and good that you're building this fantastic experience, but we're going to give you some tools on how to really think through what the user is experiencing with your design, with your goals, with your story, so that you can adjust it to actually account for real behavior. To give an example of narrative, how many people have played Angry Birds? Just out of curiosity, who still plays Angry Birds? Little lesson on the life cycles of games. It's always one of the most challenging aspects of projects. Significantly fewer hands. But you might say, well, you know, Melinda, this isn't really a game with the strongest narrative. So it works pretty well. I mean, gameplay is really the main focus here. So, okay, what's all this about narrative being so important? Well, the fact is, even though it may not have a very expansive, like, okay, you're going through the world, all of these backstories, all of these different ways you can explore the environment, always the gameplay makes sense in the world they created. It's always in line with how they're telling the story of the birds and the pigs. And yes, gameplay is a major focus here, so there's a lot of mechanics. It's a skill-based game, which is a bit different from something like Mass Effect. Mass Effect is it's a shooter game, but it has a lot of complex narratives in it. So choices you make in one game might affect you later on in a second or third game. Huge narrative world. The amount of thinking, the amount of story mapping they had to do to make sure that all of this was consistent and coherent, massive. But it's still similar in a way to Angry Birds because the consistency, understanding how each element of gameplay actually relates back to that original story. And again, a more complex narrative is in a way a mechanic, but it still always helps you tell the original story. And I think when you think about the magic of games, it's sometimes so difficult to pinpoint exactly what makes them so special. But I actually think this is a major component of it, is sometimes magic is just someone spending more time on something than anyone else might reasonably expect. And that is, in a way, what we should be doing as gamification designers, and they do as game designers. Even the first jump you take in a Mario platformer level, it's been thought through to that detail. They placed it in a specific spot because they knew exactly, this is where we need to teach this. And okay, here, a little bit later on, we're going to actually put 2 blocks here to teach you then how to double jump. We're thinking about how all this is going to work also with level 9. And the amount of detail, and I can tell you from looking at a lot of game documents, with my background in the game industry, it's so much detail. But that's its magic. That's why mechanics is such a dangerous term sometimes, because mechanics don't account for this magic. They don't account for that attention to detail. And without UX, it's very difficult to get to that level of detail. Because you have to understand how your users think by actually interacting with them. Because perception versus reality, it's a common slide today, is you have 2 choices when you're designing. You can live in your own world, and you can decide, okay, I'm going to go with my gut instinct. I think this is how users are going to experience it. I want to finish the whole thing before we really test, because I think it's necessary. But that's mostly because we're afraid of what happens if we do actually have a user test something. What happens when a real person is actually going to test what we've built? What if they don't like it? What if it doesn't do what we thought? But it's so much better to break down that wall that UX helps us do, because it makes things so much better. You save so much time and money. You can start from something small and actually grow it into something that's sustainable, something that's whole. And that's one of the biggest things that UX brings to us, is test with actual users. Think through how actual people are thinking. What are they doing on an emotional level? How are they perceiving the environment? As a quick example, in Fortnite, I saw this at a GDC talk, is they were saying that people were complaining about the fact that the zombie characters were moving so fast they were impossible to shoot. Now, if you just take that as a surface feedback, you might be like, oh, we must slow down the animation. But what they did instead is they tested, and they said, all right, let's put the zombies in a vacuum and see how people shoot at them. They found out it was actually just more of a mapping error. It was where the zombies were going, not that they were the wrong size or the wrong animation. And this level of detail of testing is exactly what UX is all about. It's about understanding human psychology beyond assumptions. Did you know that most of us actually perform worse when we're offered a reward to do a task? This has been proven over and over and over again in scientific studies. People tend to do worse. People also feel very differently about the task. You know, if you offer your friend $5 to help you move a couch, completely different psychological result than if you offer them, hey, let's have some pizza and beer after. We have to be thinking of UX and how people actually behave, not just what we want from them, not just that experience we think we have control to design, but truly what it is that they're going to respond. And there's a lot of tools to do it. I'm not going to go through these today. I popped this up here if you want to take a picture. But these things can help you in actually mapping out your user psychology and understanding the stories you're telling. Because at the end, you have to make sure your system's usable. And who dictates that usability? Your users. It's not how well you tell the story, it's how well they believe you've told the story. It's how accessible they find it to be. Because we are architects, and we are the ones who make the choices in how we're going to tell the story. That's our ownership. And to just leave you on one connected point is this gives us quite a bit of power. And especially with technology, we're getting better and better at pinpointing exactly how to, in a way, manipulate or guide people in a very specific manner on behaviors we want to see them have. And what we have to also start talking about, along with UX, because again, UX is very much a field of user psychology, is what are our ethical duties in how we actually tell these stories and how we use UX to get our goals. I'm sure a lot of you have saw the ads and the reports from the ads about how Twitter and Facebook advertisements, Twitter bots, affected the US elections. When we look at this, what do we say? Do we say clever? Was this a well-designed experience? Did they understand the narrative, they understood the user psychology, and they managed to find a way to get people on their side? Or do we say, no, there has to be a line somewhere. But if we say that, what's the line? What is it as designers when we use these tools to make sure that, well, yeah, we get to know people, the technology allows us to get that close, but how do we really make sure that we're using them with the right motivation? Is it possible? I don't know. On that note, thank you.
Melinda Jacobs, ladies and gentlemen. If you follow the talks this morning, you might see some patterns emerge. Things about prototyping, looking at your players, etc. That's great to hear. Do we have some questions for Melinda? Don't be shy. No, yeah. We have one over here.
Thanks, Melinda. Quick question concerning the part when you're talking about that psychology seems to suggest, or psychology research seems to suggest, that rewards actually make the result worse than we expect them to. What sort of lessons should the gamification community take from that? Because a lot of it is reward driven, especially on the surface.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it's not all rewards ever will always predict that type of behavior, but it does a lot. And I think what we just need to remember is a reward is a mechanic. A rewarding system, it's an approach to try to entice someone to do something. And what we have to try to figure out is the only way we can think to engage them and get them interested to do a behavior is by giving them a reward. Yeah, what good is that really doing? I mean, sure, we might get that end goal that maybe they do it, but we don't actually get to those levels of change where people actually have a mindset change. They just have it's like I saw a video of cats on the internet where they could tap a bell and they'd get a treat. The cats figured that out real quick. It's a really cute video. But they would tap the bell and they keep getting treats. And that's what you create from people. And you also create a bit of a pressure if they feel like, oh, if I don't perform this well, I'm not going to get the reward. And it's not that you can't use any of those tools to your disposal, but you just have to think about, what does this really mean for my user? What am I really saying to them by saying, I will give you a reward if you finish this puzzle fastest? Why do I want them to finish it quickly in the first place? What do I think that's going to add? And this is why I also say engagement itself is not an end goal. It never is. It is something you need, typically, to reach your end goal, but your end goal will always be something else. So sure, offer people $5 if they click on a link. You might get a lot of link clicks. But did you really achieve what you wanted?
Good point, thank you. We have a question here.
Oh, great presentation. I was just wondering, a lot of games are created by the games industry as well, and most of these games, I mean, a lot of them don't reach market success, right? So, but they put in as the same amount of effort, the same amount of design, same amount of UX testing. What distinguishes between a great success or a mega success between just what I would call normal success or even failure in that sense, right? So, and what can the gamification community then draw from that?
Yeah, and you know, this is sometimes where UX research, again, if you don't delve deep enough, and a lot of times this is the case with those sort of examples, into what really is the feedback you're getting and how it fits into your day-to-day life. So for example, with games that launch, that people might think, oh yeah, this is pretty okay. The thing is, pretty okay is not necessarily enough of a momentum in order for people to really play. And as was mentioned earlier, the landscape of online games, of mobile games, it's so big right now. You're really fighting for attention in a way that you didn't have to in the past. And even if your users like it, getting that visibility so that people actually find the game can be a big challenge, especially for a lot of indie game developers. But truly, even if they think they've been doing UX testing, a lot of times they haven't. Or they've built the whole product until it was way too late, and then they can't stop anymore because you've gone down. And I mean, this again is what UX can really help us as gamification practitioners, especially trying to explain to people why it's so important to build these very extensive, somewhat time-consuming narratives to achieve these often psychological goals. Is, yeah, you really, if you build something so big and you build almost the final product and then test, even if it doesn't work or it doesn't get what you want, you've built the whole thing. You've already spent that budget, you've already spent that time, and try picking through every element of that platform you built or that game you built or that experience you built and trying to figure out where things really are going a bit haywire. So even games that feel they may have been testing, they probably tested too late. They're either victims of just an overflooded market, or, yeah, they probably got to a point where they don't know what's wrong and they kept trying different things and they just didn't choose right. It's a competitive market.